Hey there, Alex Kidman here, today taking a quick look at the Samsung Galaxy S23 FE. It's the latest in Samsung's line of FE devices. I've recently reviewed the Galaxy FE Buds that launched around the same time as this phone, and I've already done a brief hands-on with this phone, but, well, it's taken me a while to actually get one in for proper sustained testing, to get a proper look and make a proper review, and that's what this is. And look, overall, if you want the quick form, this is a very good option if you like Samsung phones and Samsung design, but I suspect that's also going to depend on where on the planet you are. Here in Australia, the model we're getting has some interesting internal differences to the models sold in, for example, the USA, and that does affect its overall value, for better and worse. Let's get into it. First of all, let's talk design. So the Galaxy S23 FE features a 6.4-inch 1080 by 2340 pixel dynamic AMOLED 2X display, laid out in a very similar fashion to the S23 family it's a part of, albeit a little bigger than the base model S23 that it's cheaper than, because it's still an S23 phone, of course. I like that. As long as you wanted a bit more screen real estate, basically, you can have it. It supports up to 120Hz refresh rates, handled dynamically by the phone, because that's Samsung's style, although you can punch it back to straight 60Hz mode if you want to preserve a little bit of battery power. There's a range of available colours to pick from. Samsung Australia sent me the rather more sedate graphite, but if you prefer a splash of colour, it's also available in purple or cream or mint from all retailers, and blue or orange from Samsung Online only in Australia. I do like having a bit more colour choice to play with, for sure. The S23 FE feels good and it feels solid in the hand. It's IP68 rated for water resistance, and it works fairly well as a physical device. Biometrics are handled via a fingerprint unlock mechanism in the screen, and that works pretty well most of the time in my testing, which is very much on par actually with the way I find most of those fingerprint unlocks. Yes, you will have a few false negatives from time to time. This is no better or worse than most. One feature I'm not quite so keen on with the S23 FE is that it's pretty slippery. It's a slippery little sucker. It slipped out of my hands during testing, it slipped off my desk as well. And look, so far so good in terms of damage. It's survived pretty much everything. Nobody at Samsung needs to worry about their shiny review phone they've loaned me, but it feels like a matter of time before something bad happens, and if I was buying an S23 FE, I'd definitely look to buy a case to go with it. And look, I know I always say that about phones. I do think that good phones and bad phones, and every phone basically, deserves a case, but for this one, I think it's a real necessity. On the camera front, Samsung's made some real choices to keep the S23 FE under the S23 range, as befits its price point. Around the back, you'll find a trio of lenses comprising a 50-megapixel wide, 12-megapixel ultra-wide, and 8-megapixel 3x optical zoom lens. I love having the flexibility of that zoom lens because a lot of these just under $1,000 phones tend to omit that precise feature, leaving it as a premium choice. You basically get wide and ultra-wide and maybe a focusing on macro lens, but not telephoto. The S23 FE's got that. That's a big plus in my book. General shot quality across all three lenses is decent, with a couple of small caveats. Firstly, Samsung's default post-processing tends to slightly oversaturate colours. Now, I get that this is a style that a lot of people really do favour in their photos. They like that little bit extra pop of colour, but it can lead to some slightly garish results that aren't quite true to life. I've totally seen worse in phones. I've seen phones that really blow the colours out. This doesn't do that, but it is noticeable that it's there as a choice. The other caveat is with that telephoto lens, which supports up to 30 times of what Samsung optimistically calls space zoom. And look, space zoom is not new with the S23 FE. Samsung's been selling the idea of space zoom for a few years now. It's basically their rather silly proprietary term for hybrid optical and digital cropping of images. Basically using that primary 50 megapixel plus the 8 megapixel telephoto plus a bit of AI to give you an up to 30 times zoom experience, which I suppose is great if you want to peer into next door's swimming pool, but you really shouldn't be doing that, legally and ethically speaking. What it's not great for, though, are particularly compelling photos at that full 30 times zoom range. Generally speaking, you will end up with stuff that's more blocky than it should be. And typically I find that those extreme Samsung ranges just aren't all that good. The S23 FE is no real exception. If I were you, I'd take the shot with the 50 megapixel primary lens and crop in post-production. Mind you, if post-production isn't your thing, you do also get Samsung's nifty little single-take mode. And what this does is it just takes a bunch of photos, a bunch of exposures and some videos, and then it applies a bunch of filters to create images it thinks you'll like. You can pick from them. Now, creatively, is that all that smart? Are you learning much about the art of photography when you do that? No, not at all. Is it a feature I think a lot of consumers can have fun with? Yes, absolutely. Then we come to performance, and here the Samsung Galaxy S23 FE is a tale of two processors. Now, if you've watched any other reviews or read any, I would encourage you, whenever you're looking for a device, to read as many reviews as you can, take in as much info as you can. But if you've watched any other reviews or read any, you're probably aware that the S23 FE packs in a Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 processor under the hood. Not the fastest processor of 2023, but not bad at this price. Except that, well, buying one in Australia, you're not. You're not getting a Snapdragon 8 Gen 1. And I suspect this is true in other markets too, but it's definitely true in Australia. Instead, it's running on one of Samsung's own Exynos 2200 processors. Now, that's a move that Samsung used to do a lot for its Galaxy S phones here in Australia. A lot of other markets, especially the US, would get a Snapdragon. We'd get the Exynos instead. Generally a slightly less impressive Exynos as well. But how much less impressive, and does it matter? In a benchmark sense, while I don't have both the Exynos and Snapdragon models of the S23 FE put head-to-head, I have tested a lot of other Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 phones. The S23 FE with Exynos 2200 under the hood got, for example, scores of 1601 and 4003 in Geekbench 6's CPU test, that's single-core and multi-core, respectively. And look, that's not bad, but by way of comparison, a Motorola Think phone with a Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, same as the US S23 FE, got 1806 and 4729 in the exact same test. Now, this isn't to say that the S23 FE is massively slow or a bad phone per se, but it does rankle with me that the Australian market gets a slower phone. If performance is a key criteria for you, that could be a big issue. Although, as has long been the case with Exynos phones, there is an upside, which I'll get to shortly. In day-to-day usage, look, the S23 FE felt like it maybe was a little slower than I might expect, but that's often super subjective. I knew in my head, hey, this doesn't have the faster processor, so maybe my head was playing tricks with me. I think the bigger challenge here, though, is that it's seriously expected, heavily tipped, that the S24 phones are going to arrive in early 2024, just a couple of months, maybe only a couple of weeks after I'm recording this. Now, the S24 phones will not be as cheap as the S23 FE is. That's not the point I'm making here. The problem is that when the S24s arrive, the S23s, the bigger ones that the S23 FE is part of the family of, will drop in price, probably quite drastically. And that's an issue because those phones here in Australia are running on the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, furthering that performance gulf. So I think if you can afford to wait, it might be the smart play to do so. I mean, hopefully we will also see serious discounts on the S23 FE when that happens. But right now, yeah, it's a tough call to make. Where the Exynos, though, may have an edge over the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 is in battery life. And look, this is super common. Back when Samsung was doing this all the time with its Galaxy S phones here in Australia, I often used to find that the Exynos models got better battery life than I was seeing out of similarly tested Snapdragon phones of the same generation. Under the hood, this is packing in a 4,500 mAh battery, which isn't huge by current Android phone standards. Heck, 5,000 mAh is fast becoming the norm, the kind of expected. Every time I hit a phone that has less than that in the Android space, I kind of think, oh, why is that? Why have you gone smaller? But of course, battery life is not a pure number of cells game. It's really about what you can do with it and how that works. And again, some of this is subjective because everyone's usage is different. But to give you a picture of how the S23 FE with an Exynos runs, I ran my standard YouTube battery test past it. So this is just a 1 hour test from a full battery to see how low it drops. If it drops below 90%, that's a big problem because those phones typically will struggle to last a full day. And the S23 FE managed to retain 95% of its battery power, which is pretty decent. Not the best I've seen out of a Samsung phone, but certainly up there. And this is where it gets interesting, because the S22, last year's premium Samsung phone, that had a Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 in it, and I've got the same battery test numbers for it, and it dropped to 91%, a 4% difference. Might not sound like much, but it can lead to extra hours of battery life, and at 91%, that's just on that bubble of the 90% mark I mentioned. So the S22, probably a phone that struggled to last a day if you were a heavier user. The S23 FE, maybe not. And maybe that's the big benefit that you're going to see out of this Exynos model. If battery life is more important to you than performance, then the Exynos is a big uptick for you. So, should you buy the S23 FE? Well, look, it's a good phone, but I do think you need to weigh up that compromise between processing power and battery power, depending on which you prioritize most, as well as the incoming spectre of the S24 family, because that will inevitably lead to some pretty stiff bargains on the S23 phones that are decidedly more powerful than the S23 FE, some of which also have the same kind of battery life. Anyway, that's my take on the Samsung Galaxy S23 FE. Got any thoughts? Anything you'd like to know, or criticisms or tips you'd like to drop in the tip jar? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe and give your pet a belly rub. Unless maybe you keep snakes.